The global debate over gambling policy has long been trapped in a flawed binary. Governments historically choose between total prohibition and unfettered deregulation. Complete prohibition rarely works. When Russia banned nearly all gambling in 2009, the activity didn't disappear. Instead, it migrated entirely to a borderless, untaxed online black market that the state could no longer observe or control. On the other end of the spectrum, rapid deregulation fails just as predictably. In 2018, the United States Supreme Court opened the door for nationwide sports betting, triggering a rush of unmitigated market expansion. States raced to capture tax revenue before establishing adequate public health infrastructure or advertising controls. The result was a surge in social harms, particularly among young adults, coupled with revenue streams that proved highly volatile. Neither extreme offers effective state control. Treating legalization as a simple on or off switch during keys systemic policy failure. The danger of poorly managed legalization is criminogenic asymmetry. Inconsistencies between legal frameworks and illegal markets create lucrative opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. Shadow economies actively exploit these gaps, using licensed venues to launder illicit funds, parasitizing the sector and bypassing state oversight. Safe legalization requires building preemptive institutional resilience long before the first license is ever issued. To achieve this resilience, policymakers require a highly specific tool, the Legalization Readiness Index, or LRI. The LRI is a six-dimensional diagnostic framework. Its sole purpose is to systematically evaluate a state's preparedness across multiple infrastructural sectors. The absolute functional requirement of the LRI is timing. It must be applied to identify deficits before market opening, not deployed as a reaction after a crisis has begun. The LRI provides a roadmap for capacity-driven regulatory capitalism, prioritizing institutional strength over post-crisis damage control. This empty radar chart represents the LRI framework. It rejects linear economic models, instead treating state capacity as an interdependent ecosystem. At the top is institutional and regulatory capacity, carrying a heavy 25% foundational weight. If a state's regulatory agencies lack independence or enforcement power, when Ukraine legalized gambling in 2020, weak regulatory institutions and insufficient oversight resources led directly to regulatory arbitrage and systemic corruption. The second foundational pillar is public health infrastructure, also weighted at 25%. This requires a pivot in public policy. The state must move away from treating isolated individual problem gamblers and enact a population-level harm reduction framework. Spain's 2012 online gambling legalization illustrates this deficit. Permitting extensive advertising without preemptive limits resulted in a severe debt and addiction crisis among 18 to 30-year-olds. Conversely, Australia and New Zealand successfully deployed measurement tools, like the short gambling harm screen, to preemptively detect and intervene in gambling harm at a population scale. Without these two heavily weighted pillars functioning effectively, any secondary economic gains from taxation are mathematically and socially unsustainable. Next is the legal and regulatory framework axis, weighted at 20%. Singapore designed a strict integrated resort model. By enforcing an exorbitant entry levy strictly on citizens and permanent residents, they successfully isolated international tourist revenue from domestic social harm. The economic and fiscal readiness axis, weighted at 10%, tests a state's ability to plan for revenue volatility and the substitution effect. In West Virginia, new sports betting tax income simply cannibalized $45.4 million away from existing video lottery terminals, proving that gross revenue projections often ignore intra-market competition. The public engagement axis, also 10%, ensures ongoing policy legitimacy and social acceptability. Finally, the digital and technological oversight axis covers the remaining 10%. Nordic state monopoly models enforce this access effectively by utilizing mandatory player tracking and automated digital deposit limits across all platforms. True state readiness is determined exclusively by the synchronized performance of all six of these axes, acting as a single regulatory ecosystem. By plotting data points across these axes, policymakers generate a comprehensive readiness polygon. This chart shows a solid blue line outlining a highly prepared state. This balanced, expansive geometry represents an optimized regulatory environment capable of absorbing a legal market and mitigating socio-legal risks. Conversely, the inner red dashed polygon visualizes a vulnerable state context falling below the safety threshold. A skewed shape immediately flags a critical deficit. If a state displays a strong legal framework but severely contracted public health infrastructure, it is structurally unprepared to manage addiction rates. The index is weighted so that failing to secure foundational pillars, such as institutional capacity and public health, automatically pulls a state's composite score toward a critical danger zone. A score below 60 indicates that structural deficits have outweighed regulatory strengths, creating an environment where systemic failure is likely. The visual geometry of the LRI provides an uncompromising map showing exactly where state failure will occur if legislation proceeds prematurely. This diagnostic analysis translates directly into an actionable operational workflow. This chart visualizes the rational state policy cycle. Step 1 is the execution of the LRI diagnostic. It structurally acts as a mandatory legislative gatekeeper. This gatekeeper introduces the critical concept of the institutional fortification loop. If a state's LRI score evaluates below 60, the flowchart diverts to the no path. The policy is to revert strictly to building institutional capacity before reevaluating. Only states that achieve a sufficient score proceed down the chart to Step 2, legislation and strict licensing, and then to Step 3, continuous monitoring. A final functional requirement is to completely separate revenue collection agencies from harm prevention bodies. This eliminates the inherent conflict of interest. This separation is governed by the policy feedback loop, continuously routing real-time crime and public health data back into the LRI diagnostic for ongoing assessment. Mastering this cyclical policy loop, anchored entirely by the LRI diagnostic, is the only structural method a state can utilize to dismantle criminogenic asymmetry and safely capture the economic benefits of a globalized industry.